Hi, my name is Alistair Roberts. I'm a professor of public policy at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and I'm the author of this article, The Crisis of Design in American Government, which has just been published in the journal Asia Pacific Journal of Public Administration. It's available open access, that is, no paywall. Right now, you can find the link in the notes for this video. And the journal editors, Jim Perry and Danny Lamb, asked if I would do a short video, just a few minutes, to give you the highlights of what this article is about. This article is based on the Charles Levine Memorial Lecture, which I delivered at the American University School of Public Affairs in May 2025. And basically, this article makes a couple of big points. The first is that you can think about two crises in American government. The first crisis is what I'm going to call the crisis of the moment. That's the crisis that seizes everybody's attention. It's focused on all of the controversial actions that the Trump administration is taking and the potential consequences that could flow from many of these actions. But what I want to argue is that there's also a more fundamental crisis, what I'm going to call the crisis of design, a crisis in the sort of design of the constitutional order that predates Donald Trump, that to some extent explains how Donald Trump came to be, and which I would argue is going to persist even after Donald Trump winds up his term as president. And that crisis of design, as I say, has to do with the sort of fundamental architecture of the American political system as it has evolved over the last century. And the big argument I would make is that the system has become much more centralized over the last century. Centralization has two aspects. The first is vertical centralization. Responsibilities within the American system, or the balance of responsibilities within the American system, have shifted from state and local governments, particularly from state governments, up to Washington, up to the national government. There's been a centralization of governmental responsibility, and I would also argue that's been followed by a centralization in the sphere of politics, party politics as well. Party operations are much more centralized and Washington focused than they used to be. So vertical centralization is one aspect. The other aspect is horizontal centralization in Washington, by which I mean the shift of power from other actors over to the presidency itself. And I want to emphasize this has been going on for decades. It's been a century long project. It's been a bipartisan project. Both Democrats and Republicans thought centralization was appropriate at different points over the last century. And this was also a good government project. People thought that centralization in both respects would make government work better, that it would produce prosperity, security, and justice. And what I want to argue is that there have been unintended consequences of centralization, pathologies or problems that weren't fully recognized when this great experiment was undertaken decades ago. And I flag four of these pathologies in the article. The first is overload. That one of the consequences of centralization is that players in Washington have more on their plate than they can competently manage. The second is gridlock, uh, a problem that when everything is focused on Washington, you increase the risk of gridlock, the inability to make decisions, and also the problem that the consequences of gridlock are more widely diffused. The third problem is societal polarization, a problem we're all familiar with, but I would argue that the practice of focusing everything on Washington, and in particular shifting power to the presidency, which is a winner takes all institution, only one team gets the prize, the design of the system actually aggravates societal polarization. It deepens divisions. And then finally, I would argue that centralization aggravates problems of programmatic effectiveness and sclerosis. That is the problem of adaptation or reform in federal programs. Very briefly, centralization means the creation of vast and complicated federal programs that are hard to run effectively and very hard to reform. So those are the four pathologies that I associate with centralization. And I basically argue that good government reformers decades ago were conducting an experiment. They didn't know how it would turn out. And we see now the consequences, some of the unintended consequences of that decades-long reform project. Overall, what I would argue is that the fundamental problem is that the architecture of the American system is not well suited to the governance of such a vast and diverse polity. This is one of the biggest and most complicated societies in human history. The American political system is not structured to govern a society like that well. So I basically briefly make an argument for reform. It's all about essentially decentralization and the reconfiguration of political institutions in Washington. But I also acknowledge there are immense barriers to the execution of that reform program. Changing constitutions in the American context, whether it's the national constitution or the state constitutions, is very difficult. And part of the reform prescription, I would argue, is actually bolstering executive capacity in state government. And in that respect, you run into this chronic, long-standing ambivalence about the concentration of executive authority um, uh, in American political culture. So there's a broad reform agenda that I argue has to be pursued, but also daunting obstacles to reform. And there are some reformers who look at those obstacles and say, those are so massive that, let's not go there. Let's focus on tinkering. Let's focus on incremental reforms. And I argue that's actually ill-advised, actually dangerous, because this is going to be a turbulent century for the United States and many other countries. There's going to be a bundle of challenges that are confronting this country in coming decades. And the difficulty with the system is that it's not as flexible and resilient as it might be. It's got a certain characteristic of fragility to it. And the danger is that if a system isn't good at responding in a timely way to crises or problems, those problems pile up and they have the potential of becoming a polycrisis, a situation that sort of spins out of control with massive adverse consequences for the system. And I'm sure Americans don't want that. And that's the argument why we should be focusing not just on the crisis of the moment, the question of how you deal with various Trump policies, but also the more fundamental crisis of design. As I say, the article is on the web. It's downloadable for free. You can see the link in the notes for this video. Thanks for taking the time to listen to this discussion.